For a Sherman crew in 1944, spotting a Tiger at long range meant one thing. Their gun probably couldn't hurt it, and its gun could probably kill them before they got close enough to matter. That reputation wasn't propaganda. It was measured, tested, and confirmed on ranges by the Allies themselves, using captured examples, real ammunition, and real armor plate. And yet, for every Tiger that went down fighting, roughly as many were abandoned by their own crews, not destroyed, just left, broken, on the side of a road, because the engine or the transmission had given out, and there was no way to recover a 57-ton tank under fire. Some units, on some days, had barely half their authorized strength actually running. This is the story of a tank that could stop an entire column with one well-placed shot from over a mile away, and a tank that struggled to survive its own drivetrain long enough to reach the fight in the first place. Germany built barely 1,300 of them across 2 full years of production. Fewer than half were ever combat-ready at any given moment by some of the unit records that survive. And it's still, 80 years later, probably the most recognizable tank that ever existed, more famous by a wide margin than vehicles built in numbers 100 times larger. Legend or logbook? By the end of this episode, you'll have the numbers to decide for yourself. Before we go further, everything in this episode is sourced and cross-checked against published military histories, unit war diaries where available, and specification data from multiple independent references, not just the version of this story that gets repeated the most on the internet. Where the record is solid, we'll give it to you straight. Where it's genuinely disputed, and with this tank one specific engagement is disputed about as hard as anything in the entire war, we'll tell you that too, and tell you why. Full source list is in the description below. To understand why Germany built the Tiger, you have to go back before the war most people associated with, to a design problem German planners were already wrestling with in the late 1930s. What happens when the enemy fields a tank your existing guns can't beat? Design work on what became the Tiger started as early as 1937, well before Germany invaded Poland, as part of an ongoing effort to develop a genuinely heavy breakthrough tank, something built to punch through fortified lines and survive return fire while doing it, in the same spirit that shaped Soviet heavy tank thinking around the same period. For a few years, that work moved slowly, without urgency, because Germany's existing medium tanks were handling the battles of 1939 and 1940 just fine. Then came the summer of 1941 and Operation Barbarossa. German tank crews advancing into the Soviet Union ran into the T-34 and the KV-1 for the first time, and the encounter was a genuine shock. Both Soviet designs combined a sloped or simply very thick armor with a gun that could hurt German tanks at ranges German guns couldn't return the favor. It's the same pattern this channel covered with the KV-2, a design lesson learned the hard way, on contact, against an enemy nobody had fully scouted. That shock accelerated everything. 2 competing manufacturers, Porsche and Henschel, were pushed to finish rival heavy tank designs on a compressed timeline, both needing to be ready for a demonstration in front of Hitler by April 1942. Porsche's design used an unconventional gasoline-electric drivetrain that looked promising on paper and proved troublesome in practice. Henschel's more conventional mechanical design won out, and it's Henschel's version, designated the Panzerkampfwagen 6th and given the name Tiger, that actually went into production. The Porsche prototype's fate is worth a brief mention because it didn't simply vanish once it lost the competition. A number of Porsche hulls had already been ordered or partially built by the time Henschel's design was selected, and rather than scrap that work entirely, German planners repurposed the surviving chassis into a heavy tank destroyer, eventually fielded as the Elephant, a vehicle with genuinely formidable frontal protection and firepower, but even worse mobility and even worse reliability than the Tiger it was derived from. It's a pattern worth remembering for a future episode on this channel. Engineering decisions rarely disappear cleanly. They just get repurposed into the next problem. The gun came from an unusual source, an 88mm weapon derived directly from the German 88mm anti-aircraft gun, a weapon German crews were already using with devastating and slightly improvised effectiveness against tanks earlier in the war, simply by depressing the barrel and firing horizontally. Rather than improvise that trick indefinitely, German engineers built a purpose-designed tank gun around the same caliber and ballistic performance. The result was a weapon that could punch through the frontal armor of nearly anything the Allies or the Soviets fielded at ranges those same vehicles couldn't return effective fire. It's worth pausing on the design trade-offs baked in from the very start because they explain a lot of what's coming later in this episode. German ordnance planners weren't building a tank meant to be produced by the thousand, the way Soviet planners approached the T-34, or American planners approached the Sherman. They were building a smaller number of extremely capable vehicles, each one meant to individually outmatch several enemy tanks at once on the assumption that superior quality could offset inferior quantity. That's a coherent strategic bet. It's also a bet that puts enormous pressure on every individual vehicle's reliability, because a smaller fleet has less slack to absorb losses, whether those losses come from enemy fire or from a transmission that can't handle the load it's being asked to carry. The Henschel design that won out over Porsche's competing prototype used a conventional mechanical drivetrain rather than Porsche's more experimental gasoline-electric approach, which in principle should have meant a more dependable vehicle. In practice, conventional didn't mean modest. The Henschel design still had to move a vehicle heavier than nearly anything else in the German arsenal. And conventional mechanical components under that kind of sustained load will find their limits eventually, no matter how well engineered they are. Here's the thesis worth holding on to for the rest of this episode. The Tiger was designed almost entirely around one priority: win the gunnery duel at any range against any opponent, no matter what it cost in weight, complexity, or mechanical strain. Everything that made it feared came from that priority. So did nearly everything that broke down. Where the KV-2 stood out because of a single wildly oversized feature, that turret, the Tiger stood out because everything about it, individually, was built to an extreme. Start with the gun, because, same as every episode on this channel, the gun tells you what the tank was actually for. The 8.8cm KWK 36L56 fired with enough velocity and accuracy that in British post-war firing trials, 5 consecutive rounds struck a target roughly the size of a large dinner table from over a kilometer away. That's not a cherry-picked lucky shot. That's the kind of consistency that let Tiger crews open fire on Allied tanks at ranges where those tanks' own guns simply couldn't penetrate the Tiger's front in return. In a straight gunnery duel at long range, the Tiger usually didn't lose. Now the armor. Up to 100 millimeters on the hull and turret front, with a gun mantlet as thick as 120 millimeters in places. For most of 1942 and 1943, this was armor that the standard guns on Allied and Soviet medium tanks, the American 75 millimeter on the early Sherman, the Soviet 76 millimeter on the T-34, simply could not reliably beat at any range that mattered in a real engagement. A Sherman crew facing a Tiger head-on in 1943 was, in blunt terms, outgunned before the fight even started. But look at what that armor and that gun cost in weight, because this is where the story pivots. A combat-loaded Tiger weighed somewhere around 54 to 57 tons, heavier than almost anything else fielded by any nation at that point in the war, and roughly the same weight class the KV-2 sat in, but carried on a chassis that had to move faster and farther day after day in active mobile warfare rather than sitting in a defensive line. The engine tasked with hauling that weight was a Maybach HL230 P45 V12 petrol engine, producing around 700 horsepower, genuinely powerful for the era, and, on paper, more than enough to move a tank this size. In practice, that engine was operating close to the edge of what it could sustainably handle hour after hour, especially in heat, especially under load, especially with the transmission and final drive that were being asked to manage far more torque and mass than any earlier German tank design. Two more details worth knowing before we get to the operational record, because both come back later. First, the Tiger used an overlapping interleaved road wheel arrangement, multiple layers of wheels stacked to spread that enormous weight evenly across the track. It worked well for ride quality and ground pressure. It also meant that in mud, ice, or snow, debris packed between the layers of wheels and could freeze solid overnight, effectively locking the running gear in place until it was thawed or chipped out by hand. Second, the Tiger was too wide for standard German rail transport in its combat configuration, which meant crews had to swap the wide combat tracks for a narrower set of transport tracks and different road wheels just to move it any real distance by train, a process that took hours and had to be reversed again at the other end before the tank could fight. Ammunition capacity is worth a closer look too, since it connects directly to how a Tiger crew actually fought. With around 92 rounds of 88mm ammunition on board, a Tiger carried a meaningfully larger main gun ammunition supply than the KV-2's 36 rounds, a reflection of the very different job each tank was built for. The KV-2 needed a handful of enormous, slow-loading shells to crack a bunker at close range. The Tiger needed a much larger magazine of comparatively lighter, faster-loading rounds to sustain a running gunnery duel across a battlefield, potentially against multiple targets in sequence. That single-piece 88mm, loaded by one crewman rather than assembled from two pieces the way the KV-2's ammunition was, could be fired at a meaningfully faster rate, another structural reason the Tiger, gun for gun, tended to win engagements the KV-2's design was never built to fight in the first place. None of that shows up in a spec sheet. It shows up in how long it actually took to get a Tiger from a railhead to a battlefield, and how long it stayed there once the mud came. Crew life inside the Tiger, unlike the KV-2's cramped six-man arrangement, was actually a relative point of comfort by the standards of the era. A five-man layout with a genuinely capable optical sighting system from Zeiss, one of the best gun sights fielded by any nation in the war. German gunners consistently reported excellent visibility and target acquisition, which helps explain how a well-trained crew could land hits at the ranges the British post-war firing trials later confirmed. That optical quality was a real strength and a real point of contrast with a tank like the KV-2, whose crew comfort and sighting equipment were both distinctly secondary concerns behind raw gun size. It's also worth being precise about what 45 kilometers per hour actually meant in practice, because a spec sheet number and a sustained operational speed are two different things. That road speed figure was a theoretical maximum under ideal conditions with a fresh engine and a flat paved surface, not a number German crews were routinely hitting on a march through Normandy hedgerow country or Russian backroads. Sustained road speeds in real operational conditions were meaningfully lower, and cross-country speed dropped further still, especially once the interleaved wheel system we mentioned above started accumulating mud or ice.
Now, the story that turned this tank and one specific crew into a legend that's still being argued about today. A note before we tell it. The numbers in this engagement are among the most disputed of the entire war, inflated almost immediately by wartime propaganda, and we're going to walk through exactly why, rather than hand you a round number that collapses the moment someone checks a source. On the morning of June 13, 1944, a week after the D-Day landings, a British armored column, elements of the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, was advancing toward the town of Villers-Bocage in Normandy, part of a push meant to outflank German positions defending Caen. A small detachment of German Tiger tanks, part of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, under the command of SS officer Michael Wittmann, was positioned nearby, having arrived in the area after a punishing road march under repeated Allied air attack. According to the most detailed accounts, Wittmann had a handful of operational Tigers. Sources differ on the exact number, generally cited as somewhere between 5 and 6, when his position spotted the British column moving along the road toward the town. Rather than wait for orders to reach the rest of his unit, Wittmann moved his own Tiger out alone and attacked the column directly, driving alongside it at extremely close range. Accounts describe distances as short as 30 to 10 meters, firing as he went. What follows, even in the most careful modern accounts, is genuinely difficult to pin down with precision. Wittmann's Tiger tore through the head of the British column, destroying tanks, half-tracks, and other vehicles in a running engagement that lasted well under half an hour. Then he pushed on alone into the town of Villers-Bocage itself, where a British anti-tank gun finally immobilized his tank in the streets. Wittmann and his surviving crew abandoned the vehicle and made their way on foot back to German lines. Here's where the hedging has to be very deliberate, because this is one of the most mythologized single actions of the entire war. The numbers vary enormously. Some careful historical reconstructions, working engagement by engagement through unit records on both sides, put Wittmann's personal total at that morning somewhere between 10 to 14 tanks destroyed, alongside a number of other armored vehicles. Wartime German propaganda and Wittmann's own radio report shortly after the battle claimed a much higher total, in some tellings over 20 armored vehicles destroyed single-handedly, a figure that was quickly seized on and amplified for domestic morale purposes, including doctored photographs published to exaggerate the scale of destruction in the town. Post-war popular retellings have sometimes pushed the number even further. The gap between the propaganda figure and the more conservative historical reconstruction is significant, and it exists for a specific documented reason. This was, almost from the moment it happened, a story German wartime media had every incentive to inflate. Whitman's overall wartime tank kill total is separately disputed too. Various tallies credit him with anywhere from roughly 119 to 138 tanks destroyed across the whole war, mostly from his earlier service on the Eastern Front. Those figures come from a wartime credit system that recorded kills by unit and by claim, not always independently verified against enemy loss records. A documentation problem that shows up across most top ace claims from every nation in the war, not just Germany's, but one that matters enormously when a single number gets repeated as settled fact. What isn't seriously disputed, a very small number of Tigers, quite possibly acting on the initiative of one commander rather than a coordinated unit plan, did inflict serious losses on a much larger British force in a short, chaotic engagement and did meaningfully disrupt a significant Allied advance for at least that day. The tactical outcome was real. The precise scorecard is where the story gets murky, and it got murky almost immediately because both sides had reasons, propaganda for one, morale and myth-making for the other, to shape the number rather than simply report it. Worth noting, too, the battle didn't end with Whitman's initial charge. British forces, though badly mauled at the head of the column, regrouped west of the town, and further fighting continued into the following day before the overall British advance stalled and eventually was called off. The wider Operation Perch, of which the push toward Villers-Bocage was one part, is generally judged by historians to have fallen short of its objectives. But attributing that entirely to one tank commander's morning action, rather than to the broader tactical and logistical picture around Caen that week, is exactly the kind of oversimplification the myth-making around this battle has encouraged. Whitman's charge was a real event, significant one. It wasn't by itself the whole battle, and treating it as such flattens a much larger and more complicated few days of fighting into a single cinematic morning. We're telling it to you this way because the alternative is repeating a number that's been circulating uncorrected since a 1944 radio broadcast built for German domestic morale. That's not history. That's the story history left behind if nobody checks it. There's a broader lesson buried in this one, similar in shape to the Rocinante problem from our KV2 episode, but arriving from a completely different direction. Rocinante's uncertainty came from a documentation gap nobody wrote down enough, clearly enough, at the time. Villers-Bocage's uncertainty comes from the opposite problem. Too much was written down, immediately, by people with a strong incentive to inflate it. A propaganda ministry with a genuine dramatic battlefield success on their hands doesn't need to invent anything from nothing. It just needs to round the real number up, publish it fast, and let it calcify into common knowledge before anyone has the ability or inclination to check it. 80 years ago, a lot of what circulates about Whitman's career, and about this battle specifically, is that rounded up number, repeated so many times it feels more solid than it actually is.
Here's the part that the legend of Villers-Bocage tends to crowd out entirely. Across its whole operational life, the Tiger's biggest enemy might genuinely have been its own drivetrain. Multiple heavy tank battalion records point to the same pattern. Operational readiness rates, the percentage of a unit's Tigers that were actually running and combat capable on any given day, regularly sat somewhere around 50 to 70%, and in some units, during some periods, considerably lower than that. That means on an average day, something like a third to a half of a Tiger battalion's tanks weren't available to fight, not because the enemy had destroyed them, but because they were broken, waiting on parts, or mid-repair. The transmission was a particular chronic weak point. Official supply figures reportedly allocated only one spare transmission for every 10 tanks in the field, a ratio that made a transmission failure, which was common under the tank's weight and torque loads, a genuinely difficult problem to fix quickly, especially for units operating far from a proper depot. Some estimates from unit maintenance logs suggest that for every hour a Tiger actually spent operating, something on the order of 10 hours of maintenance work was required to keep it running, an extraordinary ratio that speaks to just how demanding this vehicle was on the crews and mechanics who kept it in the fight. The pattern shows up from the very first unit to take the Tiger into combat. The 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, which brought the Tiger to the Eastern Front near Leningrad in August 1942, suffered transmission failures on its very first approach march to the front, tanks breaking down before they'd even reached the sector they were meant to defend.
Records from that unit describe periods where sustained combat availability dropped to as few as 4 operational tanks out of a much larger authorized strength, and non-combat losses, tanks abandoned, destroyed by their own crews to avoid capture after breaking down, or simply written off as unrecoverable, rivaled or exceeded losses to actual enemy fire. The problem wasn't unique to any one theater. In North Africa, the Tiger's combat debut against British forces around Taborba in late 1942 went well tactically, but the desert environment combined with early mechanical unreliability, overheating, and fuel shortages to grind down an already small force through attrition that had nothing to do with the fighting itself. On the Eastern Front, the interleaved road wheel system that worked so well for ground pressure became a serious liability whenever mud, ice, or snow packed between the wheel layers and froze solid, sometimes locking a tank in place until crews could chip it free by hand, assuming they had the time and weren't under fire while doing it. Fuel supply compounded every other problem. A Tiger's stated operational range of around 195 kilometers on roads sounds workable until you factor in how much of that range evaporated in real conditions: cross-country movement, cold weather fuel consumption, and the simple reality that German fuel supply lines were under constant strain for most of the war, especially from 1943 onward, as Allied air power increasingly targeted rail and road logistics. A Tiger that ran out of fuel in the field was functionally exactly as combat ineffective as one with a broken transmission, and crews sometimes had to make the difficult choice to destroy their own immobilized vehicle rather than risk it falling into enemy hands intact, a decision repeated often enough across multiple unit histories that reads less like an occasional emergency measure and more like a routine, expected part of operating this specific tank. Recovery itself was its own chronic headache. Towing a 57-ton vehicle out of mud or off a damaged position required specialized heavy recovery vehicles that themselves were in short supply, and doctrine officially called for multiple recovery vehicles working in tandem just to move one immobilized tank any real distance. When those recovery assets weren't available, which, given how thinly stretched German logistics were by the middle of the war, was often, a broken-down Tiger simply sat where it stopped, sometimes for days, vulnerable to air attack or advancing enemy forces, until either it was repaired in place or the decision was made to abandon and destroy it. None of this means the Tiger was ineffective in combat when it actually made it to the fight. It means the fight itself was often the easy part. Getting there and staying there was where the tank's own engineering worked against it. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 is a useful illustration of just how conditional the Tiger's effectiveness really was. On paper, this was exactly the kind of engagement the Tiger was built for, a massive set-piece armored confrontation where its long-range gun and heavy frontal armor should have dominated. And in open terrain where crews could actually exploit visibility and range, that's often what happened. But Kursk also involved dense minefields, prepared defensive lines, and terrain that wasn't always open, and immobilized or damaged Tigers that couldn't be recovered under fire became losses just as surely as ones destroyed outright, adding to an attrition rate that had very little to do with which tank had the better gun. The lesson German commanders were relearning throughout the war, campaign after campaign, was that the Tiger's advantages were heavily terrain dependent, and its weight-driven vulnerabilities weren't.
If you know tanks, most of this will already sound familiar, because it's the flip side of everything that made the Tiger fearsome in Section 4. We're not going to soften it, because pretending the flaws weren't real would insult anyone watching who's read a genuine source document on this vehicle. Weight and mobility. At 54 to 57 tons, the Tiger pushed the absolute edge of what contemporary bridges, ferries, and soft ground could support. Crews routinely had to find alternate routes around bridges rated for lighter vehicles, and cross-country mobility in soft or waterlogged terrain was genuinely limited. A heavy tank sinking into mud it can't pull itself out of is combat ineffective in exactly the same way a tank with a broken track is, regardless of how good its gun is. The rail transport problem. We touched on this in Section 4, but it's worth stating plainly as a flaw. A tank that requires hours of track swapping before and after every long-distance rail movement is a tank that's slower to deploy, slower to reinforce, and slower to redeploy than almost anything else in the German arsenal. In a war increasingly defined by which side could move reserves to a crisis point faster, that's a real tactical cost, not a minor inconvenience. Maintenance burden. The roughly 10-to-1 maintenance to operation ratio cited by unit records wasn't a one-time cost. It was a constant drain on skilled personnel, spare parts, and time that a less complex tank simply didn't demand at the same scale. Every hour spent keeping a Tiger's transmission alive was an hour not spent on something else, and every Tiger battalion needed a proportionally larger logistics and repair tail than a battalion of lighter tanks required. Production cost and scale. Henschel built only around 1,347 Tigers across roughly 2 years of production, from August 1942 to August 1944, with monthly output starting around 25 vehicles and peaking at just over 100 near the very end of the run. Compare that to the tens of thousands of T-34s and Shermans built in the same window, and the strategic math becomes stark. Even a tank that wins every individual gunnery duel it fights loses the war if the enemy can field 20 tanks for every one you can build. Interleaved road wheels and cold weather immobilization. Already mentioned in Section 6, but it belongs here too as a design level flaw, not just a field problem. An arrangement that improved ride quality and ground pressure distribution created a specific, repeatable vulnerability to freezing mud and packed snow, exactly the conditions the Eastern Front offered for months at a time. Crew training and unit scarcity compounded every other problem. Because so few Tigers existed relative to the size of the German army, they were concentrated in independent heavy tank battalions rather than distributed evenly, which meant losing an experienced crew through casualties, transfer, or simple burnout from a punishing maintenance schedule was a proportionally much bigger loss than losing one crew out of a much larger fleet of standard medium tanks. A Sherman battalion could absorb a bad week of crew losses and keep functioning at something close to full effectiveness once replacement crews arrived. A Tiger battalion, already operating at reduced strength most of the time, had far less slack to give. Cost was the flaw underneath all the other flaws. Each Tiger carried a unit cost in the hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks, several times the cost of a Panzer IV, and that cost bought a weapon system that then required a disproportionate share of skilled maintenance personnel, specialized recovery equipment, and dedicated logistics just to keep functional. Every Reichsmark, every hour of skilled labor, and every gallon of increasingly scarce fuel spent sustaining a Tiger battalion was a resource not available to expand production of cheaper, more numerous, and, on balance, more strategically useful vehicles. It's the same tension we saw with the KV-2's oversized turret, an engineering decision that solved one problem brilliantly while quietly creating several others that took months or years to fully reveal themselves. None of this erases what the Tiger could do in a fair fight at range, in good weather, with a functioning transmission and a clear supply line back to a repair depot. It just tells you how narrow that set of conditions actually was, and how much of the Tiger's combat record was shaped by whether those conditions happened to be met on a given day. Production of the Tiger I ended in August 1944, after roughly 1,347 had been built, a modest number by the standards of the war's major tank programs, and one that reflects both the vehicle's expense and the strain the wider German war economy was under by that point. It was gradually superseded on the production line by the Tiger II, a heavier, more thickly armored successor that kept the same basic philosophy: win the gunnery duel at any cost, and, predictably, inherited many of the same mobility and reliability problems in an even more extreme form. Tiger production never came close to matching Allied or Soviet output of comparable vehicles, and by the final year of the war, Germany's ability to replace losses, whether to enemy fire or to the mechanical attrition we've spent this whole episode discussing, had essentially collapsed. Surviving Tigers late in the war were frequently short on fuel, short on trained crews, and short on the specialized recovery equipment needed to save a broken-down vehicle rather than abandon it. The Tiger's successor tells its own version of this same story. The Tiger II, sometimes called the King Tiger, took the same core philosophy: heavier armor, a longer and more powerful version of the 88mm gun, win the duel at any cost, and pushed it even further, to a combat weight approaching 70 tons. Only 492 were ever built, an even smaller production run than the Tiger I's, and the mobility and reliability problems that had dogged the original Tiger were, if anything, worse on a vehicle that outweighed it by more than 10 tons. It's the clearest possible illustration of a lesson German heavy tank design never quite learned in time: Making the winning formula bigger didn't fix the underlying problem, it just made the underlying problem bigger too. One Tiger story stands out from the rest because it didn't end on a battlefield. In April 1943 in Tunisia, a Tiger belonging to the 504th Heavy Panzer Battalion, numbered 131, was disabled in fighting near Point 174 after a hit from a British Churchill tank jammed its turret ring. The crew abandoned it, and British forces captured it largely intact. It was shipped to Britain, inspected by King George VI, and extensively studied by Allied engineers eager to understand exactly what they were up against. That tank survives today, restored to running conditions since 2003, and is, as of this recording, the only Tiger I in the world still capable of moving under its own power. A genuinely rare, direct physical link to a production run that barely topped 1,000 vehicles. So why does the Tiger remain, 80 years on, probably the single most recognizable tank of the entire war, more famous than vehicles built in the hundreds of thousands? Because the story splits so cleanly into two true things that both happened at once. In a one-on-one gunnery duel, at range, in good conditions, the Tiger usually won, and that fact terrified opposing crews enough to shape doctrine, tactics, and post-war memory for decades. Allied tank crews were briefed on the Tiger's capabilities, specifically, trained to avoid frontal engagements with it, and told to seek flanking shots wherever possible, a level of dedicated tank-specific doctrine most individual vehicle types never received from an opposing military. That fear was rational, earned, and does real explanatory work for why the Tiger's reputation outlived the war itself. And at the same time, roughly half of any given Tiger unit's tanks were out of action on an average day, not from enemy fire, but from the same weight and complexity that made the gun duel so lopsided in the first place. The Tiger didn't lose its reputation because the reputation was false. It lost the war anyway, because a tank that wins every fight it's actually in still loses if it can't get to enough fights fast enough, in numbers that matter. Quality bought individual engagements. It never had a realistic path to buying the war, not against opponents who could outproduce Germany's entire heavy tank program with a single factory's monthly output of T-34s or Shermans.
So, back to where we started. A Sherman crew who spotted a Tiger at long range in 1944 had good reason to be afraid. That fear was earned, tested, and confirmed. And on any given day, that same Tiger had roughly a coin flip's chance of even being running. Both of those things happened at the same time in the same tank. That's the Tiger I. If you want more of these full single-tank profiles, sourced properly, no inflated kill counts, subscribe and we'll keep making them. And here's the question for the comments. Knowing what you now know about the readiness numbers behind that reputation, was the Tiger I actually the best tank of the war, or just the most feared one? Tell me where you land, and tell me why.